Hello, my name's Martyn Warwick. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of TelecomTV in London, in England. And I'm in Washington, DC at TIA 2013. And I'm talking with Allison Cerra, who is Vice President Marketing and Comms with Alcatel-Lucent. Allison, you're very welcome. There's a lot of emphasis these days on the cloud as the market seeks to increase capacity, speed. There's more and more data crossing networks and so on. As you talk to your customers, what concerns do they have about the industry shift, which is away from managing data in private networks to handing some, if not all, of that data over to third-party cloud providers?
Yeah, so it's a common refrain, right, in the industry, and you're right. You know, the challenge that customers have is that the bandwidth among end users seems to be virtually insatiable, the demand for that is. I read a stat, I believe from Network World not that long ago, that said that demand on networks will increase by 32% over the next few years, yet CapEx investments are only increasing by less than 10% over the same period of time. So it's a pretty big disconnect when you start to think about the physics of what do you do. And so obviously when you start to think about virtualization and you begin to understand if I can run my network more efficiently by not having to build at maximum capacity and running it at maximum capacity 24/7, if we can kind of shift that way in the way that data centers shifted the cloud for compute and storage, then that's obviously extremely attractive and economical and good for users and good for carriers and the entire ecosystem. The challenges that go with that are not to be underestimated, obviously. And when you think about the cloud, the challenges become how do you manage that? How do you do it effectively? How do you deal with security? How do you deal with things like ownership and jurisdiction and compliance and forensics as data begins to become, you know, wiped or eventually it just becomes extinguished? How long does that data need to be retained? And that differs depending upon what vertical industry you're in and what the customer's unique environment is from a regulatory and a compliance perspective. So there are a lot of issues, and probably one of the biggest issues that remains is the notion of cloud sprawl. So as you have, you're right, you will continue to have private clouds, you will have more things increasingly going to public clouds, and the question becomes, when do mission critical applications really start to make their way more to the public cloud for all the reasons I just discussed, once we can keep those under alignment there. But then you've got this notion of how do you federate all of that? So how do you pick the most optimized cloud based on security needs, performance needs, reliability needs, availability at that moment in time based on context? And how do you effectively manage that between private clouds, public clouds, hybrid clouds, everything in between? We got a lot of clouds. So it becomes a bit of a challenge, to say the least, but it is a transformation that is undeniably happening. It must happen for the industry just to keep pace with end users that are driving us there. And those are some of the issues that the industry, I think, at large is discussing.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot of clouds.
Sure enough. Okay. Well, can you please then tell us about, you mentioned security just now. Right. Could you please talk about the security concerns that your customer base has as it gets more and more entrenched and used to and involved in cloud services that are often considered less secure than internal private networks? Yeah,
and it depends on how you look at security in that, right? So there's lots of different variables in security, from obviously the security of the network connection to where the data is located. Multi-tenancy is a big question. Is my data co-located right next to my competitor's data, and how is that separated for obvious reasons? So there's a lot of things with security, but you know, I think that one of the things is there's this notion, is it less secure in public clouds? I think it all depends, obviously, on who your supplier is. So there are going to be these instances where companies are quite okay with the best effort service, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you get into those mission critical services, there does become more of a question of what do those SLAs look like between the provider and between the user. And that is one thing that I think carriers have in their back pocket, is a rich legacy of providing real-time, very secure communications for a very long time. So how can they now use that as a place of advantage to go after a new field in cloud, mission critical? And how do you address some of those security concerns, leveraging what your brand has represented for so many years to so many, and really making sure that your SLAs between user and you, and that relationship and what is defined and who owns what and who's responsible for what, are clearly clearly understood, defined, and that there are, because in the event of failure, which can always happen, that there are, remedies in place, and what do those remedies look like? So I think that's really the conversation is starting to shift, as it normally does, into what's the business relationship, and who's responsible for what, and how do we think about security differently than just the technical aspects of security, but also about the bigger going concern of the relationships involved.
Thank you. As these new and growing issues become more prevalent, and as enterprises embrace what are called digital natives in their workforces, what are some of the new ways enterprises, do you think, should be thinking about when it comes to bring your own device?
So I'm a dinosaur, because I'm an Xer. And Xers, man, we had no moment in the sun. We got nothing in this. So we are like already passé. It's all about millennials. It's all about digital natives that came out of the womb texting, right? And uber connected from day one. We love them. But they are creating seismic shifts in the organization. They represent about a third of the workforce right now. They'll represent 3/4 of the workforce in the next couple of decades. So they are here and they're not going anywhere. And they are bringing the patterns that they have adopted as consumers into the workplace. I'm old enough to remember when what you got at home was way behind what you could get in the enterprise in the way of technology. Many of us remember that in the industry. You had a mobile device at work, and then you got one for the home, or you had a T1 connection at work, and then you were happy when you got DSL or cable service in the home. And that has completely flipped in about the past 10 years. And what you're seeing is that consumer technologies now outpace, in many cases, what enterprises are able to adopt, because the technology acceleration is such that even CIOs find themselves perplexed of how to manage this. So on the BYOD trend, we've done a lot of research at this at Alcatel-Lucent, and again, it goes back to some fundamentals. I had a pretty interesting conversation with one of our attorneys at work who, still remains my friend, and I don't understand how. But I had an interesting dialogue with her. I said, I took my phone off my hip and I said, who owns the contacts on this phone? Do I own them or does Alcatel-Lucent? She said, well, Alcatel-Lucent owns them. I said, okay. I said, actually, some of those contacts I got at shows. I'm at a show right now. We both are. Do I own those or do you? She said, well, we own those. You went to the show on behalf of Alcatel-Lucent. I said, some of those contacts, I actually took the person to dinner at night after the show, which I paid for. Is that my contact or is that your contact? She said, well, that's our contact. We paid for that phone. I said, really? I said, because I brought the phone into the workplace. Is that my contact or your contact? She left the conversation at that point. She said, I'm not talking to you anymore because you're obviously, not reasonable. But the point is, it raises fundamental conversations about ownership. It raises fundamental conversations about the employer-employee contract that is fundamentally being renegotiated. When we work, how we work, who has the right to monitor, who has the right to privacy, who has the right to wipe a device in the event of a threat, and do my personal things on that device also get obliterated in that. So CIOs and CTOs find themselves in an interesting turning point around how they arbitrate not just technology and not just the security of the border, which they are responsible for, but also how they now arbitrate a new cultural shift that's happening in the enterprise precisely because of these devices and technologies that surround consumers and now employees every day. So BYOD is a trend. It's here to stay. And you're going to see a lot of the same questions that service providers have around managing these networks that they do for consumers transcend that into the enterprise. For CIOs now thinking about their network being their intellectual property in the borders of the enterprise, and how do you manage that effectively with all these devices hanging off the endpoints and all these employees doing what they do? How do you make sure you protect the borders of the enterprise while allowing freedom of the employee becomes the next big question.
Fascinating question, and so many thorny issues there.
But I love it. That's what makes it interesting. And that's what makes it, so much more than the technology, which is why I think what we do in this industry is so interesting, because it's not about the technology. It's about the endpoints of the technology. That's not the devices, it's the human beings. And it's about changing the way not only we interact with each other, but the way we interact with our companies and the way we interact personally and professionally. It has all of those ripple effects that change this from a technology conversation much more into what does that mean to these relationships that have been long-standing through the ages.
Sure. Moving on, do you think that operators and service providers are keeping up with consumer demands for emerging mobile services, such as on-demand video, for example, ephemeral communications, that kind of thing? OTT players who have the benefit, of course, of not having their own networks, not having don't have to maintain it, don't have to pay for it, and all the rest of it, are often cited as being out there in front of everything, and the poor old dinosaurs and the people who own the network and are behind the curve because they're too slow to move. What do you make of that?
I think we need to stop as an industry the haves and have-nots conversation. I think it's counterproductive. I think it's toxic. I think that what we need to understand is that there are benefits to both of these players in the ecosystem. There is a greater and more vibrant ecosystem as a result of both of these players coming together. And they each offer unique strengths and advantages that make them who they are in the industry. So whether that is the network providers who do have the legacy of the networks and the reliability that I spoke to, and having those rich services and connectivity that they've offered through the years, or whether it's the new over-the-tops that really have come in and offered a new suite of applications and services that we would not have envisioned 10 years ago, and think about how much more connected we are as a result of those services, and how much more the network is utilized and gets the advantage in some cases of those services. I think that's where we need to turn the conversation. I think what we need to do as an industry is find the points of where we have common interests and common ground, such that we can develop the new business models to support those common grounds. There's rumor that was published several months ago, and I believe the Wall Street Journal, that said that ESPN might be close to a deal with at least one major operator in the U.S. Around these toll-free business models, whereby they would pay said operator for the opportunity to deliver the content over these increasingly congested and taxed networks. Why? Because ESPN and other content providers have found that things like end users don't want to have to pay for that themselves, and that is creating a point of friction where they can't get to the content. So I think it's kind of interesting we go old school and talk toll-free business models, because it really is like the toll-free numbers of the past. Businesses put out toll-free numbers to encourage interaction with end users that didn't want to pay, dare we say, because it feels like such a dinosaur, long-distance charges back in the day. But that was a win-win. You had higher traffic going to businesses, you had new business models created on the toll-free side. It was a different way to look at the industry. It's not about one being better than the other, and I'm better than you, or whatever. They each have advantages. We need to find the points of common ground, common areas of goals, and let's work from there and just establish those new commercial business models that will sustain us going to the next generation.
Thank you.
Yes.
We've been discussing the industry as it stands at the moment.
Yes.
And looking forward slightly into the future. Let's take the crystal ball a little further. If you look the next 12, 24 months ahead, which is about as much as anybody can do in this industry, what do you think are some of the major trends that will be happening and are going to have a big impact?
Well, you know what they say, he who looks into the crystal ball eats broken glass. So you got to be careful with how much you look in the crystal ball. Yeah. But I think that we can look to the past year as evidence of some of the more interesting things that I think we will be talking about as an industry for some time to come. Whether that is the rise of wearables and the quantified self movement, where individuals are really becoming empowered to know literally everything about themselves every moment of the day, and being able to capture that in a way that helps them, whether it's manage health or manage their lives, finding these ways through these wearable devices that are transparent to an individual and very inconspicuous in their environments, to really create an even more connected space for us, which it raises other questions around privacy that we'll be discussing as an industry for some time. We've talked about the cloud. Virtualization will continue because it has to. I mean, we have to get smarter about how we think about resources and how we allocate very scarce resources, whether that's spectrum or whether that's networks in general, to a virtually insatiable demand on the end user perspective. And then there's going to be questions around enterprises. I think enterprises are due for their own major transformation over the next several years, as we talked about the digital natives continuing to storm the workplace, and as you start to think about the intersection of these technologies with wearables, and that goes into the quantified workplace movement, with cloud, with mobility, with collaboration, with big data. It's the intersection of these trends that creates the seismic shift, that creates the plates moving beneath us. That's where we're going to see the biggest impact. And I think think we have the ability to write our future right now in this industry. The page has just begun, and it's really our story to write in the way of what we do over the next several years. So I'm excited to be a part of the industry, and I'm excited to be a part of a conference this week that allows us to stargaze a little bit and think a little bit in that crystal ball of what that could look like in the next 12 to 24 months.
Very interesting stuff. Alison Cerra, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.